start. So welcome to the new faces. Some old faces here and members as well, so lovely to see you. For the new people, my name is Camilla Swart, and I help to run the site here at Rise for ABSA. We're a fintech innovation hub where we work with entrepreneurs to plug the innovation into the bank and our corporate partners. So part of the work that we do here at Rise is getting to know the entrepreneurs in the ecosystem, and a very good tool for us in doing that is running these kind of events where we can do some knowledge sharing, and we take the approach of looking at trends and patterns to kind of help entrepreneurs find gaps and challenges in fintech. And then a lot of our events are also how do we help you be better entrepreneurs. So today's event is looking at that theme specifically, trying to think about how you set up structures within your business that make financial sense, the systems you put in place, the ways that you can forecast and report so that you're making better decisions, thinking about some of the trends and patterns in the latest technology about what you can integrate into your business, and then just strategically some of the things that you have to think about as you're scaling your business as it relates to financials and all those systems and rigor that you need to put in place to make sure that your business succeeds. So it's a great pleasure to have with us today some members and some friends who are part of our ecosystem. So Louw's been very much part of Rise from the beginning, a regular visitor at our events and a great support to us, so thank you for all of that. Simon has just joined us. It's like 2 months now? 2 months. Simon sits over there with the green and yellow, always the same chair, like your chair. So it's wonderful to have you with us as well, and it's always great when our members are able to contribute to the community in this way by sharing. And Sol, you too. So you're also new back to South Africa recently after a long time in Silicon Valley, so welcome home. And also great to have your expertise. So I think the best way to start is just have you each introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about the company that you represent, and maybe a little bit of background into why this area is interesting to you. So Louw, I'm going to start with you.
Thank you very much, Camilla. Thank you for having us. It's great to see a group of entrepreneurs here ready to learn a little bit about finance. We'll do our absolute best to impart some of the learnings we've had over the last couple of years. So for me, the journey actually started about 4.5 years ago, right exactly here in this space, on the 5th floor of this building. The Bandwidth Barn used to rent this 5th floor as well, and they had open desk space here for their startup entrepreneurs. And lo and behold, we got into an incubation program here, starting out straight out of articles. A friend and I, both two new qualified chartered accountants, set up shop here. We had our desk space here. I think the core belief was coming out of an audit and accounting environment, find that the bigger firms don't add the value to entrepreneurs that they really need from a finance and tax and guidance perspective in terms of running their companies. Once a year, you get a set of financial statements. You don't always understand those, and you're not always sure how to use that in your business. And you get it 6 months after year end when you're already playing a new game. Young companies grow quite fast and change and pivot a lot. So we said, what if we can take young chartered accountants and finance professionals out of that industry and plug them into the startup ecosystem? Imagine what we can achieve if emerging companies have access to a go-to finance person on a monthly basis that can actually help them plan and build and grow that company. So that's where we started Outsourced CFO. It's a financial management company of chartered accountants and finance professionals that work with predominantly emerging tech and innovation companies from here in Cape Town. So the two major lines is CFO services, which is access to strategic financial insights from chartered account level resources. And on the other side, we also have a cloud accounting and tax practice that takes care of operations, accounting, tax, and the likes. And that's more or less our story.
Thanks. Simon, hit us. What you got?
Might do quicker than that. I am a professional accountant. I come from a mainly bookkeeping and accounting practice. I started out now, I've got 9 years experience. I worked my way through the company where I worked, being assistant manager, and eventually I was the group accountant for the companies. And then after that I moved on to being a financial manager for a logistics company in Cape Town before helping launch Walworth. And we are 4 directors, 3 CAs and myself, who saw a gap in the market to help SMEs and startups realize their goals by providing transparent financial services.
Hi, yeah, so I recently returned to Cape Town, my hometown, after 15 plus years in Silicon Valley, where I worked with a number of different companies at very different stages and helped companies move through different stages in finance and operations roles. So I've helped companies raise seed round, take a seed to an A to a B, join companies at B. I've joined them at all these different levels, 2 people to 150 people. And in that role I've learned, and now I kind of offer my services to give you that strategic overview of the importance of that finance role, how it interacts with the rest of your company, and the importance of timing changes in that role and in that team as your company evolves, and how influential that is in the culture and the strategic opportunities that the company has. Yeah.
So I'm not a finance expert, so I'm going to ask the dumb questions, I guess, and hopefully the experts will fill in all the
dumb questions.
So I guess let's get into the beginnings of the nuts and bolts of kind of some of the important foundations that any startup or entrepreneur needs to start thinking about as they're setting up their business. Maybe Louw, if we start with you and everyone jump in when you have thoughts, but what are some of those kind of core components that need to be in place for any startup as they get going?
Brilliant. So I mean, finance is generally one of the things that comes a little bit later in terms of the startup life cycle. The first thing the guys need to prove market validation. They need to get their first sales. They need to get their first cash in the bank. So accounting and finance is kind of something that falls by the wayside for the first couple of months, sometimes the first couple of years of an emerging company. But very soon, if you start speaking to investors, if you start speaking to banks, if you starting to speak to an outside partner, you realize that everyone wants to see some kind of financial information. Show us the books, show us the forecasts, show us the something, like how is this business doing, what is its risk profile, and how is it progressing. And most people want to have that, want to have a set of financials in their hands. So I think that the first part to get something in place would be just basic management reporting, to make sure that the accounting transactions and the income and expenses and balance sheet items that move through the business actually just properly get recorded, and that you have a set of management reports at month end that you can A, give to the bank or give to an investor or have a conversation with your partner, but B would rather be to also help you gain insights in terms of how is this company doing, like what is its burn rate at the moment, what is its revenue growth, like how can you start seeing trends and get some insights from that. So I think management reports are the first kind of core thing to have in place, and I think I'll let the gents speak about the technology that's out there at the moment that makes it really easy for an emerging company to have good financial management reports.
Any tips, any kind of software that you've seen that helps out? SMEasy is one startup that's been doing a lot of work in helping startups keep track of their finances. Has anyone seen anything else that they think is a useful tool?
Well, go ahead.
There are mainly pretty much 2 types, either obviously locally based or cloud based. Locally based, that everybody knows, is mainly Pastel and QuickBooks, and yeah, these are mainly what sort of once-off charges. But the problem with these is getting any sort of support from either an accountant or from the company themselves, which is where the likes of Sage 1 and Xero and QuickBooks Online come on. You pay mainly a monthly fee, and yeah, the support obviously from your accountants or from the company themselves if you're having problems would come into, which obviously pays there.
Yeah, I think the other challenge and important thing to think about as you're going through this is the needs shift quite rapidly for a company if the goal of your company is to raise funds. So if you're a smaller business, kind of mom and pop, and you're kind of expecting to run a pretty steady trajectory. You're not going out to fundraise, you're not trying to look for the hockey stick growth, you're just going for 3 or 4% year-over-year type growth. You can quickly implement a set of systems and put them in there and expect them to kind of run into some unending future. But if you're viewing your growth, the important thing is to think about when those stages are going to come in and how that might change your approach. So I joined a company early on that we closed a seed round. It was a small company, and now we needed to go get a Series A round, and that happens faster than you realize, right? You go and you bring in $1 million, and suddenly you realize that $1 million's only going to last you 8 months, and it takes you 6 months to raise the next round. So you're instantly back into that flow, but you're stuck in your legacy situation of, oh, I was just seed round, we were just making a couple spreadsheets, I was working with my finance guy, and we built this basic forecast. But now I've got to report to a board, and I've got to go out and produce more viable financials with actuals versus projected and stuff like that. So I joined a company. They had a shoebox. The guy gave me a shoebox with a bunch of receipts and said, log into my bank account. There's a pie chart there. Isn't that enough for the investors? And then, and that was just this, it's not. I said, yes, that's exactly what I said. It was like, it's not. And so very quickly you have to, as an owner, you have to think before you even get there. Like, okay, I'm going to raise a seed, but that means I'm going to get a Series A. So part of that money of my seed round needs to be invested in preparing me for that A round, which is additional financial tools. So maybe now I'm going to bring Xero, I'm going to maybe use Expensify, I'm going to use some other external service and upgrade my package with my outsourced CFO service. So it's very important in that stage to think about what's next.
And that's a good point, because I'm thinking about forecasting, as you said that in what you were saying, and like so often I'll be sort of sitting in one of these meeting rooms, and the startups come and pitch to me either as a sort of sounding board or to get into the bank, and then it gets to that sort of financials bit on the slide deck, and you're like, really? You think you're going to make that much? Like, what's your advice for startups when they're thinking about doing their forecasting? Because all too often you only get one shot in front of that VC or in front of that particular corporate or partner, and when your forecasting looks like it has holes in it, it's kind of a problem. So, in your experience, how can startups really bolster their support in getting the right forecasting?
If I can jump in as a start, over the last 3 years we've worked on about 20 odd transactions that are worth over 350 million rand worth of seed and growth finance. So our team has seen a really exceptional amount of investment flowing into the different emerging sized companies. And I think getting that financial forecast right is so absolutely critical to any deal, because at the end of the day, like the valuations logic will be tested and compared to what you forecasted in terms of revenue growth and future profitability. And honestly, like when you have an Excel in front of you, you're likely to come up with a ridiculous figure that's really hard to substantiate and to walk an investor through. You have to make it as solid as you possibly can. But there are a couple of systems out there that do forecasting. You can look at something like Futurely, which is a cloud forecasting type tool. But we found like most of the corporate finance and venture capital world still work in different types of Excel models, but where you make sure that the assumptions are properly substantiated. If you with every line item within your model, can substantiate the revenue projection, the cost of sale, the expense projection, as well as you possibly can, looking at other companies in the market, looking at peer companies, looking at other industries, looking at whatever historics you have to date if you are trading already. There's a good couple of ways to make that really solid, so that when you have that conversation, they can't just blow holes in it. Because once an investor sees this assumption is really not well thought through, or you don't have backing for that, that's the end of the game. It starts snowballing, and your valuation goes off the table, and the conversation becomes really difficult. And like Camilla mentioned, you have one chance to really do that.
And they're so risk averse, it's the first thing that they're going to get upset about, right, is the finances. Anything else from you guys? Any tips on forecasting?
Yeah, I think what Louw talked about, the benchmarking becomes really important, right? If you build a model and you say, I'm going to spend 20% of my revenues on the sales team and 50% on development, and you're 5 years in or something like that, those benchmarks may not stand up to the industry norm. So there's always examples that you can go and look at in the market that give you an idea of how other companies are spending their money. Because what I've seen a lot in forecasts is that allocation towards different departments doesn't match the stage that the company is actually at, which would be acceptable in the investor market. You might have a different idea about how you want to spend your money, but from an investor's point of view, they're going to say, hey, you're 5 years out. We can't be spending all our money on R&D. We should be going to market, so we should really be more heavily spending on sales and marketing. So I think those kinds of things are really important. I also think again, to that question of what systems do you have in place, because as you move along, your forecasting becomes increasingly influenced by the actual environment that you're in and any pivot that you might make along that way. So choosing a system that gives you that kind of flexibility to change as you evolve, but also to give you rich data that allows you to build different forecasts.
And that kind of data that you're collecting, you know, the importance of being able to understand what that data means to your business, the analysis side of things. Not every founder is kind of a financial whiz when it comes to that. What tips do you guys have, generally speaking, on how they can get support for doing that analysis? Are there online tools? Are there people tools? Where would you go if you had nowhere to start in terms of your analysis?
I think what people like Outsourced CFO provide and other types of is
it's a nice plug for you there.
Thank you so much.
No problem. But you know, in the model in the US in Silicon Valley, it is very common to join companies that are quite mature, actually. If you think of it, they've raised tens of millions. They may even have a revenue rate that's in the tens or hundreds of millions, and they will still often operate with an external CFO. That there's really this person that gives that analysis and advice and guidance. And that person often joined the company when they were really, really young. Not in a full-time capacity, but in that advisory, so that they give you what we're talking about, how that kind of, oh, you're reaching for that star, let's help you think about how you get there, when you need to make certain switches and changes. So I think that I find human knowledge is far more valuable in this area than trying to Google around and get some website to interpret the data for you.
I mean, there are a couple of tools you can use to better set out and analyze your own information. But at the end of the day, having someone that can help you interpret that and have a look through that, who's worked with a couple of different companies, I think that's pretty important. I haven't yet seen software that can really do that insightfully. Hopefully, we're going to get it in the next 5 to 10 years, the way things are going. But at the moment, I'd be quite wary of using the export from some kind of system in terms of this is my understanding of my financial information or of my forecast. That might be a bit dangerous too.
And I think, you know, you're talking about that human element of expertise, and you know, I agree. When you're a smaller company, or even as these companies are growing, the deal flow you've described, having an outsourced CFO can be helpful. But for some companies, it would make sense to hire a CFO. In your experience, what do you think are the useful ways to either identify potential CFOs to come on board? What qualities would you be looking for? How do you kind of figure out who's a good culture fit from a CFO perspective? If you were hiring someone, what would you be looking at?
So if I can jump on that one. So firstly, maybe you should just make sure before you hire a full-time finance person like that it is a CFO that you're looking for, because you get a bookkeeper, you get an internal accountant, you get a financial manager, and then you get a CFO. So the CFO will be the guy who's in charge of financial strategy and cash flow and high-level systems and probably fundraising, but they're not necessarily going to also be the person who captures your banking transactions. That's your bookkeeper or accountant, and they're also not the person who's going to do your management reports necessarily, because that might be your financial manager. So just making sure within the different roles of finance that you know what type of person you want to hire in. And you're absolutely, every company gets to a stage where the volume of work and the complexity is so high, you need a full-time person in-house. We found generally that in terms of revenue and people triggers, it would be kind of like 50 to 100 million rands revenue, or 50 to 100 people plus. More or less, I mean, businesses differ a lot. Some companies bigger than that are simple enough to run externally. Some companies much smaller are too complex to do so. But that's kind of general triggers for, okay, you need a full-time finance team in-house that can run it with their full attention. In terms of looking for a specific characteristic in that person, I'd look for someone who understands the entrepreneurial environment quite well, just because if it is an emerging company still, it has to navigate the complexities of valuing a startup, of raising finance, of managing complex cash flows, of putting cutting-edge systems in place. So if you get someone who spent 40 years in manufacturing as a background, yeah, they've got a huge amount of experience. They might be a CA or something of the sort, but they won't necessarily be a good fit for your company. So looking at your company culture, the industry you're in, and the specific technical kind of direction that your company is taking, just having someone that fits in as a person and that fits in technically is super important.
Yeah, I think really understanding the risk profile. So a lot of finance is a lot of risk management at a strategic level, and that's represented by the kinds of contracts you sign and the kinds of obligations that you make. And different CFOs have different risk profiles, and it may be a lot determined by whether they spent 40 years in manufacturing at a public company. They'd have a very different set of what is okay and what risks to walk with than somebody that spent most of their life in tech and high growth companies. So I think that becomes a really important thing. I think the other thing is really from the beginning thinking about the cultural influence that this team is going to have on your company. And I think many companies, especially in this environment, are founded by techie type people, and we all come in with a certain attitude towards money and towards bureaucracy, and that may not always be a good attitude or an appreciative attitude. And you're a hacker type person, you're just like, I just want to hack this together and make this into this cool product and sell it. Like, why do I have to deal with all this other stuff? And you can wing it for a while, but at some point your investor's going to ask for it, the bank's going to ask for it, your employees are going to ask for more knowledge about what's going on in the financial side of your business. So the longer you choose to even give that any thought in how you're going to build out your company, I think the bigger pain point it becomes. I've literally been in companies where we've lost employees, key engineers, because we went from a tiny little secure company of 8 people in a garage, you know, your classic Silicon Valley startup mythology, that raises $10 million and goes from 8 to 30 people in a few months, which means you're suddenly managing millions of dollars, a team, and you have to put controls and processes in place to protect other people's money. Well, some people are like, that sucks. It feels like I'm working in a corporation now because I've got to fill out these papers. And part of that is because it was never made aware to them that was part of the evolution, that was where we as the founders wanted to take the company, and that this would occur at some point. So there's a real, like, if you play it out wrong, the price can be really high internally to the organization's culture and team. So really thinking about, as you bring in those people, as you grow up, how's that influencing? How are we going to push this out becomes important, and it's important really from day one, but it grows in importance as the company gets bigger.
Okay, so I'm going to open up for questions in a moment, but I think what's always useful is, you know, in the sort of stereotypical way of like talking about failing forward and that kind of thing, and learning from mistakes. If you had to think in your experiences of disasters, you know, what have you seen startups do in the financial side of things that you've just looked at and gone, oh my God, why would you ever have done that? Like, never do that again. If you had to share those mistakes with the audience and say, whatever you do, don't. What are you thinking?
You guys got some stories? I got
It's like what to table.
Yeah, exactly.
Sure. Wow. Yeah, I mean, there's probably a couple of stories. One of the first ones that come to mind, telecommunications company that was, the guys were entering into a multi-10 million rand deal, and when the investors said, can you guys please get involved and just have a look at where they are in terms of their current finances and compliance, there had never been financial statements, there had been not really any accounting data for the last couple of years. There was a cap table mess with the co-founder that left, and there was no tax clearance, there was extreme debt, there was almost like everything that could be wrong was kind of wrong. And then it's quite a process when you've gone a couple of years to go back and fix something quickly, because you have someone at the table who wants to invest in this company kind of nowish, and then to clean that up and to get that mess sorted out, backdated, you don't have information, the people who are working there they're not working there anymore. So that's really painful, and they got the deal in the end, and they're an amazing company at the moment, but it was close. So maybe that's kind of everything was wrong with it.
Yeah.
I think your point, I mean, I think the important thing that if you go too far down, unwinding financial transactions is very, very hard, especially if there's bad documentation. Because what is fact and what is fiction at that point, right? So everything's up for question, which makes me think of two, and one of them I shared with these guys earlier, was a company that I helped And they're a big company, they've been successful, they were in the throes of a massive acquisition, they sold advertising online, impressions ads, so they were getting paid per impression, which is a fraction of a penny. But they're a $50, $100 million business, so you can imagine how many transactions were leading up to that kind of revenue. So they're going through the acquisition, the auditors come in, they start looking through the books, they start reconciling, well over here it says there's no penny. And they started noticing that the reconciliations of the penny transactions were not accurate. Acquisition, they're like, well, let's assume in this 1 month you're 10% variance, let's extrapolate that out, so we'll, to be generous, we'll make it 8%, that means your revenues are 8% off, we're holding back $50 million on the acquisition until you can verify the revenue. And they literally hired a team of 20 people to sit in a room almost 24 hours a day to go through every single one of those transactions, which cost the company huge amounts of money, delayed the whole transaction, created uncertainty for existing investors, future investors, and potentially for the employees who thought they were hitting certain revenue goals and stuff like that. So there was kind of a failure for somebody to really be in there and watch what's going on with the books. The company got acquired. They're doing very well now. Lots of people went home rich. So it still worked out for them. There was one other company which was an example of overusing technology too soon, where they put in a very complex accounting system because they're a manufacturing and software company, so they thought they needed this complex inventory management and all of this. The problem was that the system was very rigid. It was a very audit trail heavy system. It had lots of layers of approval, which for a small company was really problematic. Add to that that there was no one in the team that was a financial expert. So the accountant would massage the balance sheet to make the P&L look right and present the P&L to the team, not the balance sheet, right? So nothing about the assets and liabilities that were going on in the company. I joined and I'm suddenly looking at the balance sheet and there's negative assets and positive, like the whole balance sheet was a mess. This person had just been moving money around from one side of the accounting equation to the other to give the kinds of reports that management wanted. Nightmare. I spent 6 months almost doing an internal forensic audit and restating the entire company's revenues, going back to the investors. You can imagine what that does to trust in a company, how investors feel about the management team. And that was because they hadn't brought anybody in to oversee finance early enough, but they brought in this fancy, rigid software system to think that that might limit the need for that external resource. I'm sorry to say that company didn't get acquired.
Cool. Well, are there any questions from the audience about what's been covered? This is your chance to ask the experts for free, so go for it.
No, that's a good question. Yeah. We've seen so many technology companies. We worked on Microsoft's BizBox program at 1,000 tech startups from 1 to 3 years old, and we worked with the top 10% of that. So say 80 to 100 of these tech startups, and so many of the guys they have good techies. They are building great technology. They've got all these ideas. They're gaining users or gaining some kind of metric traction. But at the end of the day, when you look into a monetization strategy, it's not quite figured out. It's kind of like they're building on the wing to see where this goes, to at some stage build in a monetization strat. Gosh, I mean, a company's going to be bought at the end of the day for its ability to generate either profit or revenue or capture market share. In some cases, for information, I guess, yes. But in most cases, acquisitions are based on the figures. So I always say to the entrepreneurs, show us the money. Like, you as a founding team need to understand, how will this business generate income? If it creates a product or service that has value in the market, surely someone at some stage should be willing to pay for it. Even if your whole value isn't caught up in your revenue streams, you need to make sure that you can generate some kind of revenue. If no one's willing to pay for your product, it doesn't, there's no business, right?
I think that to follow on that, I think building from that beginning, like you say, what is that kind of monetization strategy, but then revisiting that and testing it. And that's the joy of a tech company, that's software, right? You can, well, we thought we were going to go to market this way and we were going to get these revenues. And because you've got good financials and good support, you're able to validate whether you're seeing any of that. And then you can put that into your forecast and say, oh, look, we're way off. We need to adjust, or we need to pivot here, or some other adjustment needs to happen somewhere. So I think having that good model with that revenue, even if you're saying it's 18 months out or it's 24 months out, it's still there. And when I get there, I'm able to validate that I'm meeting that.
I'd almost say try to make that timeline when you get feedback in terms of actual money spent on your product or service. Try to make that as short as possible. That you, as soon as possible, put something into the market that you can see, is anyone willing to pay for this? Because if you're building something that no one's willing to pay for, it's not going to go so well. It's an important way to just think about it as a founding team. The finance isn't the exciting part of it, the product probably is, or the impact is, but getting the numbers right will enable you to be successful at the end of the day.
And speaking about, from the beginning, the show me the money bit, and kind of knowing that as a team, what's your advice as founders when you're thinking about the wider team? How transparent should the books be with the broader team? I mean, how do you communicate that so people have a realistic view but also feel safe? You know, what do you think in terms of organizational culture? What's the right messaging to be sharing?
Well, I can only, you know, in my experience in Silicon Valley, it's a very open conversation. And that's because a lot of these engineers and people are joining the team on the options side. So, though by South African and really global standards, most people in Silicon Valley get overpaid. They still want they still want options, right? So they're still wanting to know where the company is and how healthy the company is. So most companies that I've worked in, it's been part of the monthly company meeting to put up, here's how much cash is in the bank, here's how much we're burning, here's what our revenues are. And out of that, I think you definitely run the risk of, there's $1 million and we're burning $1 million a month kind of thing, right? We've got 1 month to live, like what's going on? And that becomes a leadership challenge, right? That becomes a challenge of how do you communicate to your company, because the last thing you want to do is run out of money and tell everybody after the fact, because that's going to burn you even more in terms of your reputation in the broader ecosystem. So in my experience, it's generally been about openness, but you have to come with this is what we're going to do to solve this, or this is how we're pivoting this way, or we're looking like this, but now we know that we have to go here. So it's really a message management a lot of the time.
I think you need your people's buy-in if you're going to build a great company. So that, for different founders, that's a different methodology. For some, it might be sharing revenue and profit figures. For others, it might be something completely different. That's the draw card on that. So it depends on kind of founder preference and strategy. Having employees linked to the success of the company, their remuneration, their future share options, could make sense in a lot of cases. I have also seen where that completely overwhelms a lot of the team, and people are frightened because it's actually scary to be in the driver's seat of an early stage company. So it just depends on, like, not everyone.
Delicate balance.
Delicate balance.
The new person who just joined might not want a year that you have like a month and a half runway left before the company closes down. They can't. It's not might not be good for their working. for the next person, that could be the drive that helps them close sales or build faster or whatever. So it depends on your company culture and I think founder preference.
And I think you've raised another really important thing that I see often is, you know, we'll be sitting in that room and they're pitching, and my question is always like, how much runway have you got left? And it's like, maybe 4 months, and I'm like, oh God, okay.
Right.
In your professional opinions, like, how much should people be thinking about setting aside, being conservative? I mean, can you predict that, or how do the systems help give you a little bit of mitigation against that risk? Like, can you be putting aside a certain percentage to help you with that, or is it difficult? Is it difficult to think about? I don't know.
Yeah, so there's different, whether it's from revenue that you're putting money away, or from seed funding, or from founder funding at the beginning. I think it's important to kind of have at least 6 months worth of runway at any given stage. When you start out, you want to preferably have like 12 to 18 months to be able to prove yourself, because things that you think in 6 months you're going to start hitting revenue out the park, generally companies don't. You generally need like a year to 2 years to kind of flesh that out. So make sure that from whichever source it is, whether it's early revenue generation because you're a services company, or whether it's from an angel around that you've sold a couple of shares early on, just to position it in a way where there is runway. Because I think Sol mentioned earlier as well, if you need it takes 4 to 6 months generally to raise. So if you realize we've got 3 months cash left in the bank, that is stressful because there are very few serious investors who will look at something if they say this in 2 or 3 months or next week or something we have to raise. That's a lot of closed doors after that.
They'll also hold you over a barrel and take so much of your company.
That's another big
other
risk.
side.
And they'll think you're irresponsible.
Yeah.
So you lose trust.
Books, maybe if you're in early stages, lean startup is pretty cool. Eric Ries's methodology is pretty critical in terms of like build fast, build lean. If you're scaling up, there is a book physically called Scaling Up. The EO group uses its methodology. It's really good. I can't remember who the author is now. And if it's also emerging at look at Tim Ferriss's stuff. Some of his ideas in terms of automation and scaling up are brilliant. He's got a 4-hour work week's pretty cool. Generally, Tim Ferriss's stuff is awesome.
There's another book I'm thinking of that, especially when, and I'm not going to remember the name, but I can dig it up and send it out. But especially when you're going out for investing and understanding how cap tables work and how dilution works in your cap table can be very useful and be very informative when you go into talking to a CFO or investors.
Understanding the VC game might be the one.
Yeah, there might be.
I'm also not sure who the author is, but understanding the VC game, if you want to gain insights in terms of how do venture capitalists think, and also like cap tables and different type investment instruments, that's quite good.
It just helps you to be more savvy in the conversations that you'll have with savvy people. I think the other one in terms of setting funds aside and planning and strategizing in that regard, I think it comes back again to very early on having good books. One of the things that I've seen catch a lot of companies off guard, especially when cash is short, is you go and you buy some expensive SaaS system. That's an annual payment. You bought it in June, and now it's 8, 9 months in, and you suddenly in 3 months' time you've got this huge payment. You've got to pay Salesforce or some tech stack, and that's not in your view. So you're looking at your cash burn, and you're burning 100K a month. But out there's like a 300K a month, and you haven't planned for that. So really, again, from the beginning, that's one way of setting aside money so that you're not tripped up and seeing where those expenses, building in I'm going to bring on a CFO here, and just really making sure that you have those stages you're moving through somewhere in your forecast. That's one way, I think, of setting money aside.
About impact investing. So I think the way you set up your financials to communicate your return on investment is so different when you're a social enterprise, right? So, in a normal business it would just be bottom line, but we're talking triple bottom line. So how do you quantify some of that social impact in a way that makes sense for an investor? Am I getting that right?
Yeah.
What is triple bottom line?
So it's like showing value more than profits, right?
Yeah,
so
social impact.
Some kind of communal impact. You've helped so many people in the community. It's about stakeholder engagement, who are involved with your company and how are you influencing them in the broader community.
So how a lot of how CSI teams would quantify their impact. They do measurements of number of learners with the matric results. They would quantify that as part of their bottom line, not just the amount of money spent.
The solution.
People, profit, and planet. So you're not going just for planet, just for profit. You're going for the environment. You're going for the people and the community you're working in, etc.
So in my experience dealing with these kinds of social enterprise, and I've worked with a couple, it's a lot about who your VC is, right? Who's coming in and investing, because they're going to set the terms of what metrics they want to see as part of validating that you're creating that social impact. Many social impact investors already have a set of criteria that investment pool has to realize. So Omidyar Network is a big VC investor in this space, and they may look and say, well, you know, we're mandating R1 billion towards change in transport sector, and the measurement of the transport sector are going to be these metrics. So they're going to come to you and say, you need to be able to show us these metrics. The important thing is, as a founder, is to push back and clarify what those are, because sometimes the metrics they want are things you can't produce, would be really costly for you to produce, and would become a real kind of noose around your neck. But that's typically how I've seen it play out. So there's no clear standard that I know. Maybe there are some.
I can maybe jump in because that used to be my world. But I think when you're looking at a social enterprise and you're looking at the triple bottom line, your relationship between your monitoring and evaluation officer and your CFO then become integral. So you want to be able to do that analysis with meaning. So it doesn't just mean, you know, you don't want just a bottom line that says 10 matric certificates out of this cohort of learners. You want to be able to have meaning. So, you know, it's rather, you had 10 students who started at 25% and they got 65% for maths, and the analysis of what that means in meaning helps your investor see the return on investment, so where you started to where you got to. So I think when you're doing a social enterprise and you're looking at impact from a social perspective, it's quantifiable in numbers, but it comes back to the analysis and what that means. Any other questions? Yeah.
So because most of your work is in advising, do you charge based on time, and if so, how do you scale your own practices?
Simon, do you want to jump into that one? How are you doing well work?
Yeah, it depends. Obviously, it'll be open to negotiation, but it starts with a time-based fee, and then if negotiations go that way, it could be based on a project-based fee.
So I think there is a big trend for value-based billing in services industry in general, but at the back of even the value that's offered to companies, I think there would still definitely in finance be people spending the time to make that happen. So I think through automation and better systems in the companies you work with, you can narrow down the amount of time that physically needs to be spent by a person and still deliver the same or higher value because of the technology you implement for these companies. So I think that gives you some leverage, and then yeah, it's services industry models. It's not gonna scale like a software as a service company exactly. You always have people at the end of the day at the back end of servicing clients. So there is a limit to scalability. You're not going to do 300% in a year. You'll blow your culture up and you'll lose people and you'll lose clients. But you could do 50 and 100% growth on that model for a quite long time.
Any other questions from the audience? Okay, closing statements from you guys. Anything that we didn't cover that you feel you want to leave behind as a nugget of information, a little bit of perspective or insight, or?
Yeah, I thought we were going to have a lot of the conversation around zero, and we had almost none of it at the end of the day. But yeah,
that's me avoiding that.
We jumped over some of the tech tools out there, but yeah, I mean, Zero is based out in New Zealand, and how the guys are thinking and innovating and building their software solution is quite incredible. We're pretty bullish on that, and I think there's a lot of with more than 100 plugins. There's a lot of new developments coming out through, a lot of new capabilities to help companies scale. So that's a pretty exciting one just to look into. It's one of the more expensive suites. So if you're a pre-rev startup, you might not go for the $30, $40 a month kind of system straight out of the blocks. We find it works for most size companies quite well. The other thing is, we didn't quite get to like the company valuations side of things so much. We spoke a lot about systems, but also I think as a founder, maybe a core thing to think about is how do you measure value in your company? What is it worth to you? What is it worth to your co-founders? And what will it be worth to an investor and why? And I mean, that conversation is super wide. There's so many things that can influence a discussion like that. I've seen very strict, very old school financial models and valuation methodology being accepted as this is the value of the company. I've seen very, very far out ambitious models also being accepted. So I think it's about storytelling, and it's about justifying the value that you believe is in the company without being unrealistic. Like, you can't ask someone for $10 million if you haven't earned a cent of revenue yet. So being realistic about the team and the tech that you're building, but just being a bit more open-minded than the traditional valuation methodology. I've seen yield dividends quite a lot.
I always hate it when and I'm like, so how much do you need? And it's always 1.5 million US, and you're like, you just suck that out of nowhere. You know, like, they haven't really.
Yeah.
It's too much of a cliche number. I think when you're doing your valuations and talking about what you need for your next round, the more specific you can be means you've done your homework.
It's not so smart to say that in this ecosystem to local investors.
Yeah.
You're not going to get forward.
Anything from you, Simon?
No,
Nuggets?
I think that there are two things. One is, I think, finance. It's dangerous to think of finance as an island in your organization. So I would always think about how your finance team and how you run it and who you bring in influences the entire organization, because that role grows as the company grows. The influence, sales and finance become really intimately linked. HR and finance becoming intimately linked. Legal, all of the contracts and agreements you sign have direct influence on your finance team. So really thinking of it as part of the company and part of its evolution and growth, and not as a service that you're bolting on from the outside, I think is really important. I think the other thing to always remember is, don't always accept the first answer you get from your financial person. If you don't understand it, it's in your benefit to drill at them and get the knowledge and context until you feel like you can understand it, even if you're like, I've always hated money or dealing with banking or whatever. The more you kind of push on that advisor, the more value you're getting for your money, and the better you're going to be at managing your company. So that would be like my two passes.
Well, I just want to say a big thank you to the three of you. I think it's so valuable having your expertise just here on tap almost. So I think for those of you who are members, you've seen the faces, you've heard the expertise, feel free to just have a coffee together and have a chat. And Louw, thank you so much for coming in, especially to do this for us today.
Thanks for having us.
And you know, I think both Wellworth and CFO Outsourced offer a really great service to startups in our ecosystem. So I think if you've got time, maybe chat to them afterwards and see if it makes sense for whatever stage of business you're in. And Saul, it's lovely to have you back and your expertise from the US, and sharing that in an African context again is really useful. So thanks for being back in our ecosystem. And thanks to all of you for spending lunchtime-ish with us. Sorry about the late start. And hope to have you back again in other events. For those of you who are new to Rise, if you want to find out more about how you can get more involved, please chat to the ladies on reception. They've got all the information. And to the members, nice to see you as always. Okay, thanks everyone.